The smell of vanilla pancakes filled the tiny kitchen as Sienna moved quickly, flipping them with practiced efficiency. The cheap coffee she had brewed was already lukewarm, but she didn't have time to care. She had been up late finishing a project for a client, an impossible deadline she hadn't wanted to take but couldn't afford to decline. And yet, here she was, standing barefoot in her cramped kitchen, exhausted but determined. Today was Milo's birthday. That meant balloons, his favorite breakfast, and at least a few hours of pretending she wasn't constantly calculating rent, groceries, and utilities down to the last dollar. She glanced at the clock. He would be up any minute. The living room was still half a disaster from the night before, but she had managed to string up a few decorations. A handful of blue and orange balloons bobbed near the ceiling, and a sad-looking "Happy Birthday" banner sagged slightly on one side. It wasn't perfect, but Milo wouldn't care. He wasn't the kind of kid who needed extravagance. He never asked for more than what she could give, which somehow made her want to give him everything. A muffled shuffle came from the hallway, followed by a dramatic yawn. Right on cue. Milo appeared in the doorway, his hair sticking up in about 6 different directions, rubbing his eyes with one hand while the other clutched his favorite stuffed dinosaur. He stretched, blinking sleepily at the decorated room before his face lit up. "You remembered." His voice was still raspy from sleep, but the excitement was unmistakable. Sienna laughed, placing the pancakes on the table. "Of course, I remembered. Who else eats this much sugar before 8 a.m.? Milo grinned as he climbed into his chair, already reaching for the syrup. "I love my birthday." She ruffled his hair before sitting across from him, sipping her coffee as he happily drowned his pancakes in syrup. There was something grounding about watching him enjoy something so simple. She had worried, like she always did, about whether she was giving him enough stability, enough fun, enough of a life he wouldn't look back on and feel like he had missed out. But seeing him now, so content with a stack of pancakes and a few balloons, she let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe she was doing okay. After breakfast, she led him to the couch, where a small pile of neatly wrapped presents waited. It wasn't much, just a few books, a new set of colored pencils, and the Lego set he had been eyeing for months, which she had somehow managed to snag at a discount. He tore through the wrapping paper with pure, unfiltered enthusiasm, each unwrapping met with gasps and declarations of, "This is amazing," as if she had somehow conjured each gift out of thin air. And then there was one more. Sienna spotted it tucked beneath the discarded wrapping paper, a plain white envelope, its surface blank, its edges crisp. She frowned, reaching for it. "Hey, did you see this?" Milo barely glanced up from his Legos. "What is it?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." It wasn't hers. She hadn't put it there. She knew that with absolute certainty. There had been 3 gifts, not 4. But here it was, in her hand, as if it had always been there. A strange unease settled in her stomach as she carefully slid her finger under the flap, peeling it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting unfamiliar, neat but hurried. And then she saw the signature. Milo. She felt her breath hitch. That didn't make sense. It wasn't her son's writing. And yet, there it was, scrawled at the bottom of the page. But what made her skin prickle, what sent a slow, creeping chill up her spine, wasn't just the name, it was the date. 15 years in the future. She read the words once. Then again. Her hands tightened around the letter. "Don't trust the man you're about to meet." Sienna sat very still. The hum of the refrigerator. The soft rustling of wrapping paper. The sound of Milo clicking Lego bricks together. Everything else in the room remained the same, but she felt as if the ground beneath her had shifted. It had to be a joke. A prank. Someone messing with her. And yet, who? Who would do this? Her eyes flickered back to the signature. Milo. She folded the letter quickly, slipping it back into the envelope. Milo looked up, chewing absent-mindedly on the end of a Lego piece. What was it? Sienna forced a smile, her fingers tightening around the envelope. Just junk mail. A lie. But the truth felt impossible. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight of the message inside had somehow shifted the laws of physics. Sienna unfolded the letter with cautious fingers, her pulse steady but alert, the way it always was when something didn't make sense. The paper was smooth, crisp, like it hadn't been sitting around long. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat, slightly slanted, written with purpose. And then, at the bottom, the signature. Milo. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in shallower now. She blinked, rereading the name just to be sure she wasn't imagining it. It was right there, in ink that had already dried, in a hand that was not her son's. But that wasn't even the strangest part. The date. 15 years in the future. A nervous laugh almost escaped her, but she stopped it before it could make her sound unhinged. It had to be a joke. Some bizarre, elaborate prank. Maybe Camila. No, Camila didn't have the patience for this kind of thing. Her eyes darted back to the words on the page. Don't trust the man you're about to meet. A warning. Not a vague, cryptic riddle, but a clear directive. She frowned, rubbing the crease of her forehead as if that might somehow smooth out her confusion. Maybe she was missing something. Maybe this was part of a birthday surprise, some scavenger hunt for Milo, a mix-up with a gift. But no, that wasn't right either. The paper trembled slightly in her grip. Milo, she said, trying to keep her voice casual. Are you messing with me? Milo barely looked up from his new Lego set, where he was carefully attaching a tiny plastic wheel to a race car. Huh. This letter, she said, holding it up. Did you? He frowned. What letter? This one. She waved it lightly in his direction, watching his face for any flicker of recognition. He shrugged. I didn't put anything in there. She studied him, waiting for the guilty smile that usually followed any mischief. It didn't come. The tension in her shoulders tightened, pressing against her skin like an itch she couldn't scratch. She turned the envelope over, checking for anything she might have missed. No return address. No markings at all. Just plain, nondescript paper. Her instincts told her to tear it up, pretend she never saw it, toss it into the trash with the rest of life's weird inconveniences. But she didn't. Instead, she carefully folded it back along its creases and slid it into the junk drawer under a stack of expired coupons. Out of sight. For a few seconds, she let herself believe that was the end of it. She shook her head, forcing a laugh. Probably some weird mistake. Milo didn't look up. Okay. And just like that, he was back in his world of plastic bricks and imaginary racetracks, completely unfazed. Sienna wasn't. She busied herself with clearing the table, stacking dishes, wiping away crumbs. But her mind kept drifting back to the letter, the inked words lingering in the air like the last note of a song. 15 years. She refused to acknowledge the way her skin prickled at the thought. It was ridiculous. She was exhausted. People did irrational things when they were overtired, like seeing significance where there was none, like giving weight to nonsense. She set the plates in the sink with slightly more force than necessary. The faucet squeaked as she turned it on. Water rushed over her hands, the warmth grounding her back to the present, back to the ordinary. It was just paper. Just ink. Just a joke. Nothing more. The living room was filled with laughter, the scent of chocolate cake still lingering in the air. Wrapping paper and ribbons were strewn across the floor, and Milo sat on the rug, building an elaborate Lego fortress with the enthusiasm of someone who had no idea how exhausting parties were for adults. The night had been a success: pizza, games, a slightly chaotic round of musical chairs. But now that most of the kids had gone home, Sienna finally had a moment to breathe. Camila flopped onto the couch, kicking her shoes off and pulling her hair into a loose bun. "Okay," she said, grabbing a leftover cupcake from the coffee table. "You look like a woman who has a secret." "Spill." Sienna hesitated. She had spent all day trying to ignore the letter, convincing herself that it was nothing. But as ridiculous as it sounded, the words were still there, circling in the back of her mind like a song she couldn't shake. She grabbed the envelope from the counter and handed it to Camila. Camila peeled back the flap, unfolding the letter with one hand while licking chocolate frosting off the other. Her eyes skimmed the page, her expression shifting from amusement to mild confusion. When she finished, she snorted. "Oh, come on." Sienna crossed her arms. "I'm serious." Camila held up the letter, shaking it for emphasis. "You think your 10-year-old wrote this from the future?" "No. I mean, obviously not." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "I just don't get it. Who put it there? And why does it say not to trust some mystery man I'm apparently about to meet?" Camila leaned back, propping her feet on the coffee table. "It's probably a prank. Maybe a marketing thing? Like one of those weird immersive ad campaigns where a real estate company tries to scare you into selling your house." Sienna rolled her eyes. "Right, because the historic real estate sector is known for its viral marketing strategies." "Fair point." Camila tapped the paper. "But listen, on the off chance that some mysterious time-traveling version of Milo is actually out there sending warnings, I say hold on to it. Just in case." Sienna laughed despite herself. "You're impossible. That's why you love me." Sienna took the letter back, staring at the words one last time before tucking it into a drawer. She wasn't superstitious. She wasn't paranoid. But something about it made her uneasy. And as much as she hated to admit it, Camila was right. It wouldn't hurt to keep it. The next morning, Sienna barely had time to think about the letter. The chaos of a school day morning was in full swing. Milo was trying to find his sneakers, the toaster was burning, and she had exactly 3 minutes to make herself look like someone who had her life together before leaving for a meeting that could change everything. "Mom, I can't find them." She grabbed his sneakers from under the coffee table and tossed them to him. "Check the usual places before declaring a national emergency." Milo grinned as he pulled them on. "What if I'm late for school? Then I'll have to tell your teacher that you were delayed by a tragic case of selective blindness." He laughed, stuffing his arms into his jacket. "You'd actually say that?" She handed him his lunchbox, smoothing his hair down. "Now go. I love you." "Love you too," he called as he sprinted out the door. Sienna exhaled, already thinking about the meeting. It wasn't often that someone in her position got a chance like this, a high-profile project, real money on the table. She had spent years taking whatever freelance work she could get, sketching blueprints at the kitchen table while Milo slept, balancing invoices between grocery lists. But this was the kind of project that could change her career. She arrived at the meeting with a folder full of designs, her best blazer, and exactly zero patience for the smug receptionist who barely looked up as she checked in. "Mr. Calloway will see you shortly," the woman said, typing something on her tablet before returning to scrolling through her phone. Sienna took a seat in the sleek waiting area, trying not to feel intimidated by the sheer scale of the office. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, and the air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and coffee strong enough to power an entire metropolis. A few minutes later, a door opened, and a man stepped into the room. "Sienna Grant?" She stood, smoothing her blazer. "Yes." Dominic Calloway extended a hand, his smile effortless. He was tall, polished in that way people with real money always seem to be, like he had never once worried about rent or whether his bank account would survive until Friday. But there was an ease about him, a kind of charm that felt carefully cultivated, like he was used to winning people over before they had a chance to decide whether they actually liked him. "Dominic," he said, shaking her hand. "I appreciate you coming in." "Of course," she said, following him into his office. The space was minimalist but warm, lined with architectural models and framed photographs of historic renovations. It was the kind of office that made it clear he had taste, money, and an appreciation for things that were built to last. He gestured toward a chair. "Please, sit." She did, setting her folder on the table as he sat across from her. "I've gone over your portfolio," he said, flipping through a stack of papers. "Impressive work. You have an eye for details most people miss." Sienna resisted the urge to sit up straighter. "Thank you." He leaned back, studying her. "I have a property, an old theater that's been sitting vacant for decades. I want to restore it, keep its character intact while making it functional for modern use." She felt a flicker of excitement. Restorations were her passion. Anyone could tear something down and start over, but preserving history while making it new again? That was an art. "That sounds like an incredible project," she said. "I think so," he said, smiling. "But I need the right person for the job." She opened her folder, pulling out sketches she had prepared based on what little she knew about his company. "I took the liberty of drafting some initial ideas." His eyebrows lifted slightly, impressed. "I like initiative." She slid the sketches across the table. "I wanted to preserve the marquee, maybe incorporate some of the original Art Deco elements into the new design. We could modernize the interior without losing its soul." He studied the designs, nodding slowly. "This is good." She allowed herself to exhale, just slightly. "But," he said, meeting her gaze, "I have high expectations. If I bring you on board, I'll need complete dedication." Sienna didn't flinch. "I don't take on projects unless I plan to give them everything." His smile widened, like he had been waiting for that exact answer. "Then we might have something to talk about." The moment his name left his lips, something in Sienna locked up. Her fingers stilled on the edge of her folder, her posture tightening, as though her body recognized something before her mind could catch up. Dominic Calloway. The name settled in the air between them, familiar in a way it shouldn't have been. The letter. The ridiculous, impossible, unreadable letter. She tried to play it off, shifting in her chair, forcing a small smile. "Calloway," she repeated, like she was making sure she'd heard it correctly, like she wasn't trying to remember how to breathe. Dominic nodded. "You've heard of me?" Sienna hesitated, only for a second, but it was enough for him to notice. "Maybe," she said, reaching for her water glass, stalling. "Your firm has done some high-profile restorations." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with something like amusement. "I try to work with people who respect history as much as I do." She nodded, pretending to focus on the conversation, pretending she wasn't mentally cataloging every detail about him in some kind of silent, frantic analysis. He looked exactly like the kind of man who had been successful for a long time: tailored suit, relaxed confidence, the kind of sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. His presence filled the room, not in an overwhelming way, but in a way that made it clear he was used to people listening when he spoke. Sienna reminded herself that none of that made him untrustworthy. But still, the letter had been sitting in a drawer in her kitchen for weeks, untouched but not forgotten. She forced herself to shake it off, nodding as he spoke about his plans for the theater renovation. The longer she listened, the more ridiculous she felt. There was nothing strange about this. He was a businessman with a vision, and she was an architect who could bring that vision to life. There was no reason to panic over some anonymous warning. By the time the meeting ended, she was almost convinced of it. Almost. Over the next few weeks, she saw more of Dominic than she ever expected. The contract negotiations were smooth, the process surprisingly effortless. He wasn't just another client, he was involved, invested in every detail. He asked thoughtful questions, listened when she talked about design choices. He had a way of making her feel like her input truly mattered, which was rare in her line of work. He also had a way of making her forget about that gnawing sense of doubt. It wasn't just work. There were invitations, exclusive architectural tours, industry events, places where people talked about things she had only read about in magazines. Dominic introduced her to developers, investors, people she never thought she'd be in the same room with. It was intoxicating, the way her world seemed to open up. She told herself it was just business. But sometimes, when he leaned in slightly to hear her better, or when he laughed at something she said with an ease that felt entirely genuine, she wondered if he saw it that way. And then there was Milo. It started subtly. A passing mention in a conversation, a question here and there. How old was he? Did he like school? Then one day, Dominic surprised her by remembering the name of the book Milo was obsessed with. She should have found it strange. Instead, she felt flattered. Sienna sat at her kitchen table long after Milo had gone to bed, her laptop casting a dim glow against the darkened room. A mostly untouched cup of tea sat next to her, now cold, forgotten. Her search history was a mess: news articles, corporate websites, financial reports. If someone had asked her a month ago whether she would be running a deep dive on a real estate developer like he was some kind of political candidate, she would have laughed. But here she was, scrolling through pages of information about Dominic Calloway, looking for something, anything, that would justify the unease that still lingered beneath the surface. It was pointless. Everything she found painted him as exactly the man he appeared to be. He was a known name in the world of high-end real estate and historic preservation. Articles praised his dedication to restoring forgotten spaces, repurposing old buildings instead of tearing them down. Interviews described him as a visionary, a businessman with a passion for revitalizing communities. There were photos of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, smiling mayors, interviews where he spoke passionately about his work. His financials were clean, no scandals or lawsuits. No whispers of fraud. No former partners warning the public about shady business dealings. It was almost frustrating. Sienna closed the laptop and rubbed her eyes. She had been hoping to find something, some tiny flaw, some forgotten controversy that would validate the strange warning in the letter. But if Dominic was dangerous, the internet had yet to take notice. She pushed away from the table, stretching her arms over her head. Maybe Camila was right. Maybe the letter was just a stupid prank, or a mistake, or, she didn't know. Something that didn't require this level of paranoia. But as she rinsed out her tea mug, she couldn't quite shake the thought that maybe some things didn't show up in neatly archived articles. Milo had been quiet lately. It had started gradually, small things, easy to dismiss. At dinner, he didn't talk as much as he usually did. His answers were short, clipped, like he was distracted by something he couldn't quite put into words. His usual excitement over his books and Legos had dimmed, like a light on a dimmer switch that had slowly been turned down without anyone noticing. At first, Sienna chalked it up to school. Maybe he was tired, maybe something had happened with one of his friends. He was 10, kids went through phases. But then, a few nights ago, she had gone to check on him and found him lying awake, staring at the ceiling. Milo, she had whispered, keeping her voice soft in the dark. He had startled slightly, turning his head toward her, eyes wide and alert in a way they shouldn't have been at that hour. "You okay?" she had asked. He had hesitated just long enough for her to know he was about to lie. "Yeah," he had said. "Just thinking." She had brushed his hair back, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Thinking about what? His tiny shoulders had lifted in a shrug. Stuff. She hadn't pushed, but she had known. Something was bothering him. And now, tonight, she woke to the sound of him crying out in his sleep. She was out of bed in an instant, padding down the hallway, pushing open his door to find him tangled in his blankets, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "Milo," she said gently, sitting on the edge of his bed and brushing his damp hair from his forehead. "Hey, baby, wake up." His eyes shot open, wild and glassy, his chest rising and falling too fast. "It's okay," she soothed. "You were dreaming." He blinked rapidly, trying to orient himself, his hands gripping his sheets so tightly his knuckles were white. Sienna rubbed his back, feeling the tension in his small frame. "Do you want to tell me what it was about?" For a second, she thought he might. His lips parted slightly, his throat working around the words he was deciding whether or not to say. But then he shook his head, staring at his hands instead of her. "No," he whispered. She felt something deep in her gut twist. "You sure?" she asked softly. Another tiny shake of his head. She let it go. For now. She pulled the blankets up around him, kissed his temple, and stayed until his breathing evened out again. When she finally slipped out of his room, back into the quiet of her own, she felt a chill she couldn't quite explain. Sienna sat across from Dominic in the sleek conference room, her hands resting on the stack of papers he had just slid toward her. The room smelled like expensive leather and fresh coffee, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a perfect view of the city below. It should have felt exhilarating, being here, being part of something big, but instead, there was a tightness in her chest that she couldn't quite explain. Dominic leaned forward slightly, his expression effortlessly charming, the kind of charm that made people want to agree with him just to keep the moment pleasant. "It's a smart move, Sienna," he said smoothly. "If we sign today, we lock in the best rates before the market shifts." Sienna nodded slowly, flipping through the documents, though she already knew she wouldn't be signing them. At least, not today. The agreement was a bigger commitment than she had expected. It wasn't just about the restoration of the theater anymore. It was a broader partnership, one that would tie her financially to Callaway Developments for the next several years. "I just think it's a little soon," she said carefully. Dominic smiled, but she caught the flicker of impatience behind it. "You know this is a good deal," he said. "We have the vision. We have the funding. You'd have complete creative control." She did know it was a good deal. But it was also a fast deal. And something about that didn't sit right. "I just need a little more time to go through everything," she said. "I don't want to rush a decision like this." Dominic sat back, exhaling as if she were making this harder than it needed to be. "Of course," he said, his voice still light, still friendly. "But don't overthink it, Sienna. Opportunities like this don't wait forever." The words lingered as she left the office, the weight of them pressing against her ribs. Camila was already waiting for her when she got to their usual cafe, 2 lattes on the table, her sunglasses perched on top of her head like she had just returned from solving a high-profile scandal. She had a way of looking effortlessly put together, even in the middle of a casual lunch. Sienna dropped into the chair across from her, exhaling. "That bad?" Camila asked, pushing a latte toward her. "Not bad," Sienna said, stirring the foam absent-mindedly. "Just fast." Camila arched a perfectly shaped eyebrow. "Define fast." Sienna hesitated. "He wants me to sign contracts, financial commitments. Bigger than I expected." Camila took a slow sip of her drink. "And let me guess, he makes it sound completely reasonable." Sienna gave a small, tight laugh. "That's his gift. He's persuasive." Camila tilted her head. "Sienna, let me just say one thing." Sienna sighed. "You're going to say it even if I don't let you?" Camila smiled. "Correct. Listen, I know he's charming. I know he's smart. But you've known this guy for, what, a couple of months? You don't just tie yourself to someone financially because they make good eye contact and wear expensive suits." "I'm not tying myself to him," Sienna said, but the words didn't come out as convincing as she wanted them to. Camila sat back, studying her. "You're hesitating. That's enough of a reason to wait." Sienna wanted to argue, wanted to say that she was just being overly cautious, but the truth was, Camila was right. She was hesitating. And hesitation was something she never ignored. Later that night, she sat on the edge of Milo's bed, watching him as he flipped through the pages of his book without really reading. His eyes weren't moving across the words the way they usually did, and she knew his mind was somewhere else. "Milo," she said softly, reaching out to smooth his hair back. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded, still staring at the book in his lap. "The nightmares you've been having," she said gently. "What are they about?" Milo hesitated, gripping the edge of the page. For a second, she thought he wouldn't answer. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "He ruins everything, Mom." The words sent a chill down her spine. She swallowed. "Who, baby?" Milo shook his head, his eyes darting toward the door, like he was afraid someone might hear him. "I don't know," he said. "But he does." Sienna felt something deep and unshakable settle into her gut. She didn't know why, or how, but she knew without a doubt, this wasn't just a bad dream. Sienna's grip on the edge of Milo's blanket tightened. The room was dim, the soft glow of his bedside lamp casting long shadows against the walls, making everything feel heavier, denser, like the air itself had thickened. "He ruins everything, Mom." The words echoed in her mind, looping over and over, refusing to settle. Milo had never met Dominic. Not in person. Not in passing. He didn't even know his name. And yet, here he was, curled up in his bed, speaking about him like he was already a part of their world, like he had already left his mark. She forced her voice to stay calm. "Milo, what do you mean? Who ruins everything?" Milo shook his head, eyes fixed on the blanket in his lap. "I don't know," he whispered. His voice was so small, so certain, that a deep chill settled in her chest. She could have pressed him. Pushed for details. But something in his face told her he wouldn't give them, maybe because he didn't have them. Maybe because this wasn't something as simple as a bad dream or a passing thought. She smoothed his hair back, even though he was already pulling the blanket up to his chin. "It's okay," she murmured, even though it wasn't. "Try to get some sleep, baby." Milo nodded but didn't say anything else. Sienna lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to every small creak of the apartment, feeling as if she had stepped into something that was already in motion, something she didn't yet understand. The next day, Dominic called. His voice had that easy, controlled smoothness to it, the kind that never faltered. "There's an event this weekend," he said. "One of those stuffy old money charity galas. But it's good for networking, and I'd like you to be my guest." Sienna hesitated, shifting the phone to her other ear. "I don't know, Dominic. I have a lot going on." "I won't take no for an answer," he said, a teasing edge in his tone. "This is important for the project. Besides, you'll have a good time." She should have said no. She almost did. But his insistence, his confidence, made her feel like declining would be admitting to something, admitting that she was rattled, that she was thinking too much, that she was letting herself be affected by a 10-year-old's nightmare and a letter she had no logical explanation for. So she said yes. The night of the gala, she stood in front of her closet longer than she should have, trying to shake the strange unease curling around her ribs. It was just an event. Just a business function with expensive champagne and people in suits and gowns talking about things they barely cared about. She chose a deep green dress, something sleek but understated, something that made her look like she belonged in a room full of people who had never had to check their bank balance before ordering a drink. When Dominic arrived, he looked as effortlessly polished as always. Black tuxedo, crisp white shirt, a presence that commanded attention without trying. He kissed her cheek in greeting, his cologne sharp and familiar, like something that would linger even after he was gone. "You look stunning," he said, and his voice was warm, but she caught the flicker of something else in his eyes, something almost calculating, like he had expected nothing less. The venue was exactly what she had anticipated: high ceilings, glittering chandeliers, servers weaving through the crowd with trays of champagne flutes. The kind of place where money wasn't just present but woven into the very fabric of the room. Sienna let Dominic guide her through the crowd, introducing her to people whose last names she recognized from headlines and glossy magazine covers. He was in his element here, effortlessly charming, slipping from one conversation to the next with the precision of someone who had been doing this his entire life. She smiled at the right moments, made small talk with strangers who looked at her with polite curiosity, as if trying to place her in the hierarchy of people worth knowing. And then, as she reached for a glass of champagne from a passing tray, someone touched her arm. She turned, expecting to see a familiar face, but instead, she was met with a woman she had never seen before. Dark hair pulled into an elegant twist, sharp cheekbones, eyes that held something almost frantic beneath their composure. The woman leaned in close, as if they were old friends sharing a secret, her voice barely above a whisper. "Trust the letter," she said. Sienna's stomach dropped. The woman's grip on her arm tightened, just slightly. "Stay away from him." Then, just as quickly as she had appeared, the woman was gone. Sienna stood frozen in the middle of the gala, the glass of champagne still in her hand, the bubbles rising in slow, mesmerizing spirals. The woman was gone. No trace of her, as if she had never been there at all. The music swelled around her, the hum of polite conversation continued, laughter floated through the air, but everything felt wrong. Trust the letter. Stay away from him. She scanned the room, her pulse quickening, but it was useless. The woman had vanished into the sea of glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos, swallowed up by the effortless flow of the elite. Sienna swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. Dominic returned to her side, resting a light hand on the small of her back. "You disappeared on me." His tone was casual, but there was something in his expression, something assessing, like he was studying her reaction. She forced a smile. "Just needed a breather." "It's a lot." He nodded, his smile easy, practiced. "These events can be overwhelming." Sienna nodded along, pretending to listen as he introduced her to someone, but the words barely registered. All she could think about was the woman's voice, the urgency in it. She didn't stay long after that. She made an excuse, let Dominic call her a car, and spent the entire ride home staring out the window, her mind spiraling in a dozen different directions. The next morning, she sat across from Camila in their favorite cafe, her hands wrapped around a too-hot mug of coffee, the smell of fresh pastries floating around them. The normalcy of it was grounding, but only slightly. Camila listened, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her cup as Sienna relayed everything: the woman, the words, the way it had left her feeling like she was balancing on the edge of something sharp. Camila exhaled. "Okay, that's officially creepy. Right? And you don't know who she was?" Sienna shook her head. "No idea." Camila leaned forward. "Then you need to figure it out. Because between the letter and Milo's nightmares, this is officially too much weirdness to ignore." Sienna stared down at her coffee. "I tried looking into Dominic before. There's nothing. Just a lot of success and good press." "Then you're not looking in the right places." Camila's voice was firm. "People like him don't get where they are without stepping on someone along the way. You just have to find the right person." Sienna sighed, rubbing her temple. "And how exactly do I do that?" Camila arched an eyebrow. "You said he has business partners, right? Investors?" "Of course." "Then start there." Sienna hesitated, but the unease hadn't left her since last night. It sat in her chest, heavy and insistent, like a warning bell that refused to quiet. Later that afternoon, she sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her, searching through lists of past deals Dominic had been involved in. It wasn't hard to find names. Real estate was built on partnerships, collaborations, shifting alliances. But she needed someone who had left. Someone who wasn't still tied to Dominic. And then she found him. Harrison Tate. A former partner in Callaway Developments, listed on several projects up until 3 years ago, then, nothing. No mentions, no ties, as if he had been wiped from the company's history. She found a LinkedIn page that hadn't been updated in years, an old business profile with a disconnected number. But there was an address. The next day, she drove across town to a small office space above a coffee shop. The door was slightly ajar, and a faded sign on the glass read Tate Consulting. She knocked, pushing the door open. Inside, the office was modest, a single desk, a few scattered filing cabinets. A man sat behind the desk, his sleeves rolled up, dark hair dusted with gray at the temples. He looked up as she stepped inside, his brow furrowing. "Can I help you?" Sienna hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. "I think you can." Harrison leaned back in his chair, eyeing her with mild suspicion. "And you are?" "Sienna Grant." She took a breath. "I'm working with Dominic Callaway." His expression didn't change, but she caught it, the slight shift in his posture, the way his jaw tightened. Sienna pressed forward. "I need to know if there's anything I should be aware of." Harrison let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "That's an interesting question." She held his gaze. "I'd like an interesting answer." Harrison studied Sienna for a long moment, his fingers drumming lightly against the surface of his desk. His expression was unreadable, his eyes flickering with something that looked almost like amusement, but not the good kind. The kind that said, "You think you want the truth, but you don't." Sienna held her ground, even as something unsettled curled in her stomach. He let out a sigh, leaning back in his chair. "You're working with Dominic." "Yes." "And you came all the way here because..." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Because I think there's something I don't know. Something I should know." Harrison exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "You're not the first." A strange chill worked its way up her spine. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened a drawer, pulled out an old notebook, and flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for. He turned the book around, tapping a name on the list. "Angela Morgan." "I assume you've never heard of her," he said. Sienna shook her head. Harrison nodded, like he expected that. "She was an architect. Talented, ambitious, a little like you, I'm guessing. Dominic took an interest in her, hired her for a big project, promised her a career-changing opportunity. A few months later, she had nothing. He drained her. Legally, of course. Loans, joint investments, contracts that looked airtight but weren't." Sienna stared at the name, her fingers curling into fists in her lap. "She lost everything?" Harrison nodded. "And she wasn't the only one." Sienna's heart pounded. "How many?" "Enough." A slow dread spread through her, thick and heavy, but she forced herself to stay calm. Why didn't anyone come forward? If he's done this before, why isn't there? Harrison cut her off with a humorless chuckle. "Because Dominic Callaway doesn't break the law, Sienna. He bends it. He's careful. He doesn't leave loose ends, and he doesn't come after women who can fight back." Sienna's throat felt tight. "How do you know all this?" Harrison's eyes darkened. "Because I helped him do it. For years." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Sienna's pulse throbbed in her ears. She had come looking for answers. And now that she had them, she wished she hadn't. Harrison leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "You don't want to be next." She swallowed, gripping the edge of her chair to keep herself steady. "Why are you telling me this?" His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because you asked." Sienna left his office in a daze. She drove home on autopilot, her mind racing in circles, trying to find something, anything, that would make this make sense. Had Dominic already started? Was she already being pulled in? But then, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered the question she hated the most. What if this is just a lie? What if Harrison had his own agenda? What if he was twisting things, using fear to push her away from Dominic? She had spent weeks working with Dominic. She had seen how he operated, how he treated people. He was powerful, persuasive, but had he ever pressured her? Had he ever done anything to suggest that she was being manipulated? Her stomach twisted. She needed to be smart. Careful. She couldn't let him know she was pulling away, not yet. So she did it gradually. She stopped answering his calls right away. Took longer to respond to his emails. Cancelled a lunch meeting with the excuse of a last-minute client request. It wasn't enough to raise suspicion, but it was enough to create space. And as she did, she watched him. She waited. And she wondered if he noticed. Sienna had never been someone who ignored her instincts. They had carried her through college while working 2 jobs, through single motherhood, through impossible deadlines and tough clients. And now, her instincts were telling her something was off. The problem was, she wasn't sure if they were telling her the truth or if they were being fed by paranoia. She started small. She let Dominic's calls go to voicemail and responded hours later instead of immediately. She stopped accepting the little things, the overpriced bottle of wine he sent after a long work week, the leather-bound architecture books that arrived at her office, the sleek pen engraved with her initials that she knew had cost more than her monthly grocery bill. I can't accept this, she told him when he handed her a gift-wrapped box at lunch one afternoon. Dominic tilted his head, surprised. Why not? She forced a smile. It's too much. You've already done so much for me. He studied her, fingers drumming lightly against the table. I like to invest in the people I believe in. The words should have been flattering. A few weeks ago, they would have been. But now, she felt the weight of them pressing against her chest. Instead of agreeing, she pushed the box back toward him. I mean it. No more gifts. His jaw tightened, but then he smiled, like it didn't matter. Like it was just a minor detail. She knew better. Over the next few days, he started dropping by unannounced. The first time, it was at her office. She had been sketching design updates, completely absorbed in her work, when she looked up to see him standing in the doorway. Thought I'd take you to lunch, he said smoothly, leaning against the frame like he had always belonged there. Sienna kept her expression neutral, her pencil tapping lightly against her notebook. I wish I could, but I'm swamped. His eyes flicked over her work, then back to her. You've been avoiding me. She forced a laugh. Don't be dramatic. He didn't move. Something in the air shifted, so subtly that if she hadn't been paying attention, she might have missed it. His smile stayed in place, but there was a thread of something beneath it, curiosity, maybe even suspicion. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Fine, he said, pushing off the doorframe. I'll let you get back to it. But don't work too hard. She exhaled when he left. The second time, it was at her apartment. She had just gotten home from picking up Milo, her arms full of groceries, when there was a knock at the door. Milo dropped his backpack by the couch, already flipping through one of his books as she set the bags on the counter. Another knock. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and opened the door. Dominic. He stood there, holding a bouquet of deep red roses, smiling like this was completely normal. I was in the neighborhood, he said. She didn't believe that for a second. Sienna glanced at Milo, who was watching from the couch, his face unreadable. She stepped onto the doorstep, closing the door slightly behind her. Dominic, you can't just show up here. He looked amused, like she had just said something endearing. I wanted to see you. She kept her voice steady. I told you, I need space. He handed her the flowers, but she didn't take them. His fingers tightened slightly around the bouquet before he let out a soft chuckle. You're making this unnecessarily difficult. She swallowed. I don't think I am. For a second, she thought he might push. Might ask why, might demand an answer she wasn't ready to give. But then, just like before, he let it go. He placed the flowers on the small table beside her door, gave her a look she couldn't quite decipher, and left. That night, she barely slept. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds of Milo breathing in the next room, running over every conversation, every interaction, wondering how much he knew. How much he had already figured out. She got up to get a glass of water, the apartment quiet and still. And that's when she saw it. An envelope, slipped under her door. Her stomach tightened as she bent to pick it up, the paper smooth beneath her fingertips. She already knew what it was before she even opened it. Another letter. She unfolded it carefully, the words jumping off the page, sharp and clear. You're almost there. Don't let him see you doubt. Her hands trembled. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't being paranoid. Someone else knew exactly what was happening. And they were watching. Sienna had spent the entire day feeling like she was balancing on the edge of something, like she was standing at the top of a staircase that she hadn't realized was crumbling beneath her. It had started that morning when she found the letter under her door. She had folded it neatly and tucked it into her purse, telling herself she would deal with it later, but it sat there like a weight, pressing against her with every step she took. By mid-afternoon, she was exhausted, mentally preparing for the post-school routine, homework, dinner, maybe convincing Milo to clean up the growing collection of Lego pieces he had spread across the living room floor like an obstacle course. But then, at exactly 3:27 p.m., her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, expecting it to be Camila or an unknown number trying to sell her an extended car warranty. Instead, it was the school. She answered immediately. Hello? Hi, Ms. Grant, said a voice she didn't recognize. This is Mrs. Patel from the main office at Ridgewood Elementary. Sienna's grip tightened around the phone. Is everything okay? There was a pause. Too long. Too unnatural. Milo hasn't been picked up. Her stomach plummeted. What do you mean? Her voice came out sharper than she intended. We've been waiting with him, but I'm on my way. She was already grabbing her bag, already out the door, already running every possible scenario through her head. Maybe there had been a miscommunication. Maybe the teacher had mixed up the dismissal list. Maybe Milo had misunderstood something and was waiting somewhere else. She sped to the school, barely registering the traffic, barely breathing at all. When she arrived, she practically sprinted into the office, her heart hammering against her ribs. But Milo wasn't there. Mrs. Patel, a woman in her 60s with a kind face and worried eyes, stood to greet her. We tried calling his emergency contacts, she said, but no one's seen him. Sienna's vision blurred at the edges. What do you mean no one's seen him? Mrs. Patel sighed, glancing down at the clipboard in her hands. He left school like normal. We confirmed with his teacher that he walked out through the main doors. With who? Sienna interrupted, her voice breaking. Mrs. Patel hesitated. We don't know. Sienna's knees nearly buckled. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. She forced herself to take a breath. Think. Milo was smart. He wouldn't just go with someone he didn't know. But if he was with someone he did know. Her stomach lurched. Dominic. She pulled out her phone, her fingers fumbling as she scrolled through her contacts. She hit call. It rang once. Twice. 3 times. Then his voice. This is Dominic. Leave a message. She hung up. I need to check something, she told Mrs. Patel before rushing back out the door. She called Camila next, even though she knew Camila wasn't picking him up today. No, I haven't seen him, Camila said the second she answered. Why? What's wrong? He's missing. The words didn't feel real. Saying them out loud made her feel like she was floating outside of herself, watching this happen to someone else. I'm coming, Camila said immediately. Sienna didn't even respond before hanging up. She called Dominic again. No answer. Time stretched unbearably. Each minute heavier than the last. Then, finally, her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered before the first ring even finished. Hello? Hi, is this Milo's mother? Yes, she nearly shouted. This is Sarah. I work at Eastwood Books on 5th Street. A woman just brought your son here, he's safe, but I think you should come right away. Sienna didn't ask any questions. She just ran. 5th Street wasn't far, but it felt like miles. When she arrived, she burst through the door, scanning the small, cozy bookstore, her breath short, her hands shaking. Then she saw him. Milo sat on a worn-out armchair near the back, his legs tucked up, a book open in his lap. His head snapped up when he saw her. Mom! She nearly collapsed as she reached him, pulling him into her arms, breathing him in, her hands moving over his shoulders, his back, his face. Are you okay? What happened? Who? Milo pulled away, confused. Mom, he paused, studying her, like he was looking for something that wasn't there. Sienna's pulse pounded. What? His brows furrowed. It was you. What? The lady, he said. The one who found me. She looked just like you. Sienna's stomach turned inside out. She was you, Milo said softly. But you looked older. Sienna sat on the floor of her apartment, the dim light from the kitchen casting soft shadows along the walls. Milo was asleep, finally, curled up in his bed after what had felt like the longest night of her life. She had spent hours watching him breathe, brushing his hair from his face, reassuring herself that he was real, that he was home, that he was safe. Except she wasn't sure any of those things were true. Her hands trembled as she reached for the latest letter, the paper thin and crisp between her fingers. She read it again, even though she already knew the words by heart. You're almost there. Don't let him see you doubt. And now, Milo's voice echoed in her head. It was you, Mom. But you looked older. She pressed her fingers to her temples, squeezing her eyes shut. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. A stranger at a bookstore, a woman at the gala, letters appearing out of nowhere. Except they weren't strangers. They were her. Her chest tightened, and she exhaled sharply, trying to focus, trying to find some logic in something that was completely impossible. The letter wasn't from some faceless person hiding in the shadows. It wasn't a hoax, or a prank, or a mistake. It was her own handwriting. She had dismissed it at first, convinced herself it was just close enough to be unsettling but not actually hers. But now, staring at it, she knew. The way the letters slanted slightly to the right, the way she looped her LS, this wasn't just someone pretending to be her. This was her. Somehow, in some way she couldn't understand, she had sent these letters. Which meant that whatever was coming, whatever she had been warned about, was real. Her hands clenched around the paper. She wasn't losing her mind. She wasn't imagining this. And if her future self had gone through the trouble of warning her, of trying to change something, then it meant she had a choice. She could do something different. She could stop whatever was coming. She forced herself to breathe, to slow the wild spiral of thoughts racing through her head. Then she noticed something. A small, hard shape tucked into the corner of the envelope, nearly hidden in the crease. She turned the envelope over, shook it lightly, and something metallic slipped into her palm. A key. Small. Unremarkable. But she knew exactly what it was. A storage unit key. She turned it over in her fingers, her heartbeat picking up again. Her future self had left her a key. And that meant, somewhere out there, a part of her past, or maybe her future, was waiting for her to find it. The storage facility was the kind of place no one noticed. Tucked between a hardware store and an abandoned dry cleaner, it had a dull beige exterior and a flickering fluorescent sign that barely worked. Sienna stood outside, gripping the key so tightly in her palm that the edges pressed into her skin. She had barely slept. After finding the key, she had spent the night staring at it, wondering what kind of person she had become in the future, the version of herself who had sent these letters, who had left behind a key as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Did she know Sienna would come here? Did she remember standing outside this exact door, trying to work up the nerve to turn the lock? She took a deep breath, stepped inside, and approached the front desk, where a man in his 60s sat flipping through a newspaper. He barely looked up as she handed him the key. Unit 304, he muttered, passing her a clipboard. Sign here. She signed without thinking and took the elevator up to the 3rd floor. The hallway was cold, lined with identical doors, metal and impersonal. She counted the numbers until she found 304, then hesitated, her fingers hovering over the lock. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Then she turned the key. The door rolled open with a heavy metallic clang, and she stepped inside. At first, it didn't seem like much. A single shelving unit, a few boxes stacked neatly. No dusty antiques, no mysterious safe, no dramatic evidence waiting to be uncovered. Just paper. She stepped closer, her breath slow and measured. Folders. Stacks and stacks of them, arranged carefully, as if someone had spent hours making sure they were in order. She reached for the first one, flipping it open. Financial records. Names she didn't recognize. She turned the page. A photograph. A woman in her early 30s, smiling at what looked like a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Below the photo, a note, Angela Morgan. Architect. Career destroyed. Sienna's fingers trembled as she reached for another folder. More financial documents. Another photo. Another woman. Another note, Emily Rivera. Business owner. Lost everything. She felt sick. The folders went on, each one dedicated to a different woman. Each one following the same pattern. The investments. The contracts. The promises. Then the losses. And in every single case, Dominic Calloway's name was somewhere in the paperwork. She pressed a hand to her mouth. Harrison had told her the truth. This was Dominic's pattern. This was what he did. He found smart, ambitious women. Women who had talent, potential. He offered them opportunities too good to pass up. He convinced them to trust him, to depend on him. And then, piece by piece, he dismantled their lives. Sienna forced herself to keep looking, flipping through the folders as if she would find some explanation, some proof that this wasn't what it looked like. But there was nothing. Just documentation of every step he had taken to ruin them. She closed the last folder, her breath uneven. Dominic would make his move soon. She felt it. He had already started pushing her, urging her to sign contracts, making sure she felt like she needed him. And if she had needed him, if she had been in a worse position, if she had been just a little less careful. She pressed her hands against the edge of the shelving unit, steadying herself. She wouldn't let this happen to her. She wouldn't let this happen again. But she had to be smart. She couldn't let Dominic know she knew. Not yet. So she did the only thing she could do. She put everything back exactly as she had found it, closed the storage unit, and walked out as if she had never been there. And when Dominic called later that evening, she answered with a smile in her voice. Like nothing had changed. Like she still trusted him. Like she wasn't already planning exactly how to bring him down. Sienna had known this moment was coming. She had felt it in the way Dominic's attention had sharpened, in the way his invitations had become more deliberate. It was no longer about charm or casual business conversations. It was about control. And now, here he was, standing in front of her desk, effortlessly composed, delivering what sounded like the perfect opportunity. "There's a retreat this weekend," he said, sliding a sleek brochure across the table. "Private estate. Just a handful of high-level investors. The kind of people you need to know if you want to take your career to the next level." Sienna picked up the brochure, scanning the images of sprawling vineyards, infinity pools, sun-drenched terraces. It was exactly the kind of place Dominic would bring someone right before pulling them into something they couldn't escape. She set the brochure down carefully. "This seems extravagant." Dominic smiled, leaning forward slightly. "You deserve extravagant." The words made her skin prickle, but she forced herself to laugh lightly, like she was flattered instead of wary. "I don't know, Dominic. A weekend away? It's short notice. You can make it work." His tone was smooth, confident. "I want you there. These investors are looking for fresh talent. If you impress them, you could land projects that would set you up for years." Sienna hesitated, knowing she had to be careful. If she said no outright, he would push. If she agreed too easily, he would know she wasn't being honest. She sighed, pretending to think it over. "I'd need to arrange something for Milo." "I can help with that," Dominic offered immediately. "I know a great place." "No," her voice came out too sharp, too fast. Dominic raised an eyebrow. She forced herself to soften. "I mean, I have it covered. I just need to check with my friend." Dominic studied her for a beat longer than necessary, then nodded. "Good. Let me know when it's settled." He left the office with the same confident stride he always had, but Sienna barely had a moment to breathe before she was grabbing her phone and dialing Camila. The second her friend answered, Sienna didn't waste time. "I need your help." Camila's voice was instantly alert. "What happened?" Sienna lowered her voice, glancing toward the door. "He invited me to a retreat. A private estate with investors." Camila was silent for half a second. Then, "This is it." "I know." Sienna ran a hand through her hair. "I think this is when he tries to make his final move. Whatever that is." "You can't go," Camila said immediately. "I have to go." Camila groaned. "Sienna. This might be my only chance to get proof," she interrupted. "I need to see exactly what he does, how he does it. If I walk away now, I might never get another opportunity." Camila exhaled, long and frustrated. "You realize this is insane, right?" "I do." "And that this could go horribly wrong?" "Yes." Camila muttered something under her breath. Then, after a long pause, she said, "If you're going, you're not going alone." Sienna frowned. "You just said I shouldn't go." "I meant not without backup." Camila was already thinking ahead, her voice shifting into problem-solving mode. "I know someone. A private investigator. His name is Reed. He's good at what he does." Sienna let out a shaky breath. "You trust him?" "He helped my cousin when her ex was trying to screw her over in court. He knows how to keep things quiet." Sienna gripped the edge of her desk. "Okay. What do we tell him?" Camila's voice was firm. "We tell him you're walking into a trap. And we make sure he's there to watch Dominic when it happens." The estate was exactly what Sienna had expected, grand, secluded, and dripping with quiet luxury. The kind of place where powerful men sealed deals with handshakes over glasses of aged whiskey, where the weight of money was so thick in the air it practically altered the oxygen levels. She stepped out of the car, adjusting the strap of her bag as she took in the sprawling vineyards, the marble fountains, the oversized glass doors reflecting the setting sun. Dominic was waiting for her at the entrance, smiling like this was nothing more than a romantic weekend getaway. His suit was effortlessly perfect, his hair neatly styled, his presence as intoxicating as ever. "You made it," he said, placing a hand on the small of her back as he led her inside. She smiled, careful to keep any trace of tension out of her expression. Wouldn't miss it. The truth was, she had barely slept the night before. She had gone over every worst-case scenario, every possible way this could spiral out of control. But there was no turning back now. Inside, the house was buzzing with quiet energy, servers moving efficiently with trays of champagne, guests lounging in elegant clusters, laughter humming beneath the surface like a well-rehearsed symphony. Dominic guided her past the crowd, down a private hallway, and into a sleek office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the estate. "I wanted to talk before the weekend gets too busy," he said, closing the door behind them. Sienna turned, watching him carefully. "About?" He moved to the bar, pouring 2 glasses of wine, handing her one. "You and me. Our future." She took the glass but didn't drink. "That's a big topic." Dominic smiled. "I think big." He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a sleek folder. "I've been thinking," he said, placing it in front of her. "We work well together. We trust each other." She felt her pulse quicken but forced herself to maintain an air of curiosity, not suspicion. "We could build something incredible," Dominic continued. "Something lasting. A true partnership." She let out a small, breathy laugh. "Are you asking me to marry you or go into business with you?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Why not both?" She stared at him, unsure if he was joking. Then he opened the folder. Inside, neatly stacked, were contracts. Pages and pages of legal documents, filled with fine print and clauses she hadn't seen before. She ran her fingers lightly over the pages, skimming the language. It was sleek, polished, designed to sound airtight. But as she flipped through, a particular section caught her eye. A failed investment. A liability clause. And her name. Her chest tightened. If she signed this, she wouldn't just be Dominic's business partner. She would be responsible. For millions. For debts that weren't hers. She looked up at him, keeping her expression neutral. "This is a lot to take in." Dominic smiled, reaching for her hand. "You don't have to decide tonight. But I want you to know how much I believe in us." She returned the smile, her grip tightening on the contract. "I just need to read everything carefully," she said, "before I sign anything." Sienna knew the moment Dominic realized she wasn't going to sign. It wasn't a dramatic shift, he didn't slam his hand on the desk or raise his voice. No, Dominic was too practiced for that. But the way he watched her changed. The charming ease that had been there just moments ago sharpened into something calculating. His smile held firm, but his fingers drummed against the desk a little too hard, a little too fast. "You seem hesitant," he said, tilting his head slightly. She gave him her best apologetic smile. "It's just a lot to process. A big decision." Dominic's jaw tightened for half a second before he exhaled, his expression softening. "I get that. It's a lot of responsibility, but that's what makes it exciting. You and me, building something together." He reached across the desk, lightly touching her hand. "Partnerships require trust, Sienna." She nodded, ignoring the way her skin crawled. "I just need a little more time to go over everything," she said. "I want to be thorough." His eyes stayed on hers, unblinking. "Of course. But don't wait too long." She felt it then, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was it. He had decided she was either in or out, and if she was out, there would be consequences. Later that night, after forcing herself through a dinner full of polite conversation and expertly disguised tension, she returned to her room at the estate, her mind racing. She locked the door behind her, sat on the edge of the bed, and exhaled. Then she saw it. An envelope. Sitting neatly on her pillow. She froze. For a long moment, she just stared at it. Then, slowly, she reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the note. Don't sign. He's waiting for one signature to trap you. She swallowed hard, gripping the letter in her fist. Whoever she was in the future, wherever she was, she knew. She had seen this play out before. Sienna closed her eyes, breathing through the rising panic. She needed to act. She reached for her phone and texted Camila. It's happening. Bring Reed. Now. There was no reply for a minute, then, on our way. Sienna tucked the letter into her bag and forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't let Dominic sense the shift. She needed to stall. The next morning, she met Dominic on the terrace, acting as if nothing had changed. I've been thinking, she said, swirling her coffee in her cup. You're right, I don't want to wait too long. Let's go over the contracts again tonight. Dominic's smile returned, but she didn't miss the flicker of something darker beneath it. I knew you'd come around, he said smoothly. By evening, Camila and Reed were parked a mile away from the estate, waiting. Sienna had given them the time and place. The moment Dominic handed her the contract, she took a deep breath and pretended to read. Outside, Camila and Reed moved fast. The investigator had been tracking Dominic for weeks, collecting information, reaching out to the women he had ruined. He had enough. Enough to take Dominic down. Enough to make sure this never happened again. Sienna placed the contract on the desk, stalling, fingers skimming the pen. Then, just as Dominic leaned forward, the front doors burst open. Reed. Camila. And behind them, 2 police officers. Dominic's face barely moved at first. Then his smile disappeared entirely. Sienna. His voice was eerily calm. What is this? She stood, stepping back. This is you finally getting caught. Reed walked in, holding up a thick folder. We have statements. Witnesses. Documents that show exactly how you operate. And we have enough to make sure you won't do this again. For the first time, Dominic looked truly stunned. Then he laughed. It was soft, almost amused. You think you've won? Sienna met his eyes. I know I have. The officers stepped forward, and Dominic's expression darkened. He turned to Sienna, his voice low. This isn't over. But she just smiled. Yes, Dominic. It is. As the officers took him away, she let out a breath she had been holding for weeks. That night, back in her apartment, she checked on Milo, brushing his hair back as he slept peacefully. Then she saw it. A final letter on her nightstand. She picked it up, her heart pounding. You saved us. Thank you. She sat down slowly, exhaling. Milo stirred, blinking up at her sleepily. She smiled. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't look afraid.